After making all those whom the boat had brought happy, Napoleon went to prepare to march on St. Pölten, and I left the gallery. I found the duty salon filled with generals and officers of the guard. All my comrades were there as well, and each congratulated me, both on my expedition and on the new rank the Emperor had granted me, addressing me in conversation by the title of squadron leader. The commission itself, however, was not granted to me until the following month, after I had, once again, purchased it with a new wound. Do not accuse the Emperor of ingratitude. The events of the war absorbed him during the month of May, and, as he always addressed me as commandant, Napoleon thought that, trusting in his promise, I should consider myself such. During the journey from Melk to St. Pölten, the Emperor and Marshal Lannes asked me several more questions about the events of the night. They halted opposite the old castle of Dürnstein, situated on the opposite bank. This place had a double interest. It was at the foot of the hills where this castle stands that, in 1805, the memorable combat was fought, which Marshal Mortier, separated from the rest of the French army, sustained with courage to open himself a passage through the Russian troops, and, in the Middle Ages, the towers of the castle of Dürnstein had served as a prison for Richard the Lionheart. While examining those ruins, and thinking of the fate of the royal warrior who was kept there so long, Napoleon fell into a profound reverie. Did he then have a presentiment that, one day shut in by his enemies, he would end his life in captivity? Marshal Lannes, having heard several cannon shots towards St. Pölten, hurried to that town, in whose streets several charges had taken place between our vanguard and the little light cavalry the enemy still had on the right bank, which, too weak to resist us, promptly fell back toward Vienna. All my comrades being busy carrying orders, I found myself alone with the marshal, when, upon entering St. Pölten and passing before a convent of nuns, we saw the abbess come out, crozier in hand, followed by all her sisters. The holy women, frightened, were coming to ask for protection. The marshal reassured them, and, as the enemy was fleeing in all directions and our troops were occupying the town, he thought he could dismount. A burning sun had succeeded the storm of the previous night. The marshal had just ridden 3 leagues at a gallop. He was very hot. The abbess invited him to come and take some refreshments. He accepted, and there we were, both of us, in the convent, in the midst of about 50 nuns. In an instant, an elegant table was set, and a splendid collation served. I never saw such profusion of syrups, preserves, and sweets of every kind, to which we did honor. The nuns filled our pockets with them, and offered several boxes to the marshal, who accepted them, saying that he would take them to his children from those ladies. Alas, he was never to see his dear children again. The Emperor and Marshal Lannes slept that night at St. Pölten, from where the army reached Vienna in 2 days. We arrived before that city on May 10th, very early in the morning. The Emperor went immediately to the royal chateau of Schönbrunn, situated half a league from the city. Thus, 27 days after his departure from Paris, he was at the gates of the Austrian capital. It had been thought that Prince Charles, hastening his march along the left bank of the Danube and recrossing that river by the bridge of Spitz, would be in Vienna before our arrival, but that prince was several days late, and the capital was defended only by a weak garrison. The city of Vienna, properly speaking, is very small, but it is surrounded by immense suburbs, each of which, taken alone, is larger and more populous than the city itself. Those suburbs, being enclosed only by a simple wall, too weak to stop an army, Archduke Maximilian, who commanded in Vienna, abandoned them and withdrew into the city, behind the old fortifications, with all the fighting men. Yet, had he wished to make use of the courage and efforts of the population that offered itself to him, he could have resisted for some time. He did nothing of the kind, and, upon their arrival, the French troops occupied the suburbs without firing a shot. Marshal Lannes, misled by an inaccurate report, believed that the enemy had also abandoned the city, and hastened to send Colonel Gayhenuk to inform the Emperor that we occupied Vienna. Napoleon, impatient to announce that great news, ordered Monsieur Guéheneuc to set out at once for Paris. But the city still held, and when Marshal Lannes wished to enter it at the head of a division, we were received with cannon fire. General Tarot was wounded, and several soldiers killed. The Marshal brought the troops back into the suburbs, and, after sheltering them from the city's fire, he thought it right to send Colonel Saint-Mars, his aide-de-camp, to carry a summons to the governor, having him accompanied by Monsieur de Lagrange, who had long been attached to the French embassy in Vienna and knew the localities perfectly. A parlementaire ought to advance alone, accompanied by a trumpeter. But, instead of conforming to this usage, Colonel Saint-Mars took 3 orderlies. Monsieur de Lagrange did the same, so that, including the trumpeter, they were 9. That was far too many, and the enemy believed, or pretended to believe, that this group had come rather to examine the fortifications than to deliver a summons. A gate suddenly opened and gave passage to a platoon of Hungarian hussars, who, charging sabre in hand at the parlementaires, grievously wounded them all and carried them off prisoners into the city. The enemy horsemen who committed that act of barbarity belonged to the Schekler regiment, the same which, in 1799, had massacred before Rastatt the French plenipotentiaries Robergeot and Bonnier, and grievously wounded Jean Desbris. On learning with what outrage the Austrians had shed the blood of the parlementaires sent by Marshal Lannes, the Emperor, indignant, hurried up and had a great number of howitzers brought, to fire that night on Vienna, whose defenders immediately opened a terrible fire on the suburbs, which lasted 24 hours, at the risk of killing their fellow citizens. On the morning of the 11th, the Emperor surveyed the environs of Vienna, and, perceiving that Archduke Maximilian had committed the enormous fault of not garrisoning the Prater Promenade, he resolved to seize it by throwing a bridge over the small arm of the Danube that bathes the Prater. To that end, 2 companies of voltigeurs first crossed by boat to the other bank and occupied the Lusthaus pavilion, as well as the neighboring wood, from which they protected the construction of the bridge, which was completed during the night. As soon as it was learned in Vienna that the French, masters of the Prater, could march from there toward the Spitz gates, the garrison's only line of retreat, the agitation was very great. New events soon increased it. Indeed, toward 10 o'clock in the evening, our gunners, sheltered by the vast and solid buildings of the imperial stables, began to launch shells into the city, and soon fires broke out in several quarters, notably in the Graben, the finest square of the city. It has been said, and General Pellet wrongly repeated, that Archduchess Louise being ill at that time in her father's palace, the commander of the garrison had informed the Emperor of the French, and that the latter had ordered the battery's positions changed. That is a tale invented for effect, for Marie-Louise was not in Vienna during the attack, and, if she had been there, the Austrian generals certainly would not have exposed their emperor's daughter to the perils of war, when, in a few minutes, a boat could have carried her to the other side of the great arm of the Danube, which, with proper care, would not have aggravated her condition. But there are people who, wishing to find the marvelous in all things, have taken pleasure in making the life of the Archduchess saved by the very man whose throne she would soon share. Our shells continued to fall on the city, when, in the middle of the night, Napoleon, leaving to the artillery generals the care of directing the fire, set out to return to Schönbrunn, where Marshal Lannes was also lodged. There was a superb moonlight, the road was good, and the Emperor therefore set off at a gallop, as was his habit. He was riding, for the first time, a charming horse that the King of Bavaria had given him, Count de Canisy, Napoleon's equerry, who, by his functions, was bound to try out the mounts he presented to the Emperor, having no doubt neglected that precaution, nevertheless asserted that the horse was perfect. But, after a few paces, the horse fell, the Emperor rolled to the ground, and lay there, giving no sign of life. We thought him dead. He was only unconscious. They hastened to lift him, and, despite Marshal Lannes's remonstrances, he wished to complete the journey on horseback. He took another mount and set off at a gallop for Schönbrunn. On arriving in the vast courtyard of that palace, the emperor formed, in a circle around him, the numerous staff and the squadron of his guard, witnesses of the accident that had just happened to him, and forbade that it be spoken of. That secret, entrusted to more than 200 persons, half of whom were simple soldiers, was so religiously kept that the army and Europe remained ignorant that Napoleon had nearly perished. The equerry, Count de Canisy, expected to be severely reprimanded, but Napoleon inflicted on him no other punishment than that of riding the Bavarian horse every day, and, the very next day, Monsieur de Canisy, having been thrown several times to the ground, so weak were the animal's legs, the emperor granted his equerry grace, urging him to examine more carefully in future the horses he presented to him. Learning that his retreat was threatened by French troops, masters of the Prater, and seeing the Austrian capital on the verge of being totally set on fire by shells, Archduke Maximilian evacuated Vienna during the night and withdrew behind the great arm of the Danube by the bridge of Spitz, which he destroyed. It was by that same bridge that the French army had crossed the Danube in 1805, after Marshals Lannes and Murat had seized it by means of a ruse that I made known to you when speaking of the Austerlitz campaign. The departure of Archduke Maximilian and his troops left the city of Vienna without defense and delivered to the populace, which was already beginning to pillage. The authorities of the city therefore hastened to send to Napoleon the venerable General O'Reilly, the Archbishop, as well as the President of the Estates and the principal magistrates, to implore the clemency and assistance of the victor. Immediately, several regiments entered the city, more as protectors than as conquerors. The populace was restrained, their weapons were taken away, but the civic guard kept its own, which it had made very good use of to maintain order in 1805, and it showed itself once again worthy of that mark of confidence. Marshal Lannes' corps was established in Vienna as well as in the suburbs, and his headquarters in the palace of Prince Albert of Saxe-Teschen, whom his marriage with the celebrated Archduchess Christine, governess of the Netherlands, had made the richest lord of the Austrian Empire. That palace, situated on the rampart near the Carinthia Gate, was truly magnificent. Prince Murat had occupied it during the Austerlitz campaign, but the marshal entered it only once, for a few moments, preferring to lodge at Schönbrunn in a private house, from which he could more easily communicate with the emperor. Upon our arrival in Vienna, we found Monsieur Saint-Mars and Monsieur de la Grange, as well as the escort they had had when going to parley. They were all grievously wounded. The marshal had Monsieur Saint-Mars carried to the palace of Prince Albert. From the beginning of the 1809 campaign, the English had done everything in their power to arouse new enemies against Napoleon by stirring up the German populations against him and his allies. First it was the Tyrol, which the treaties of 1805 had torn from Austria to give to Bavaria, that revolted in order to return to its former sovereign. The Bavarians, commanded by Marshal Lefebvre, had to sustain several bloody engagements against the Tyrolean mountaineers, who had taken for their leader a simple innkeeper named Hofer, and who fought with heroic courage. But, after some brilliant successes, they were beaten by the French troops coming from Italy, and their leader Hofer was taken and shot. Prussia, humiliated by the defeat of Jena, but not daring, despite England's urgings, to run the risks of a new open war against Napoleon, nevertheless wished to hinder his successes. It took, between war and peace, a middle course, condemned by the law of nations of all civilized peoples. Indeed, Major Schill, marching in broad daylight out of Berlin at the head of his hussar regiment, traversed northern Germany, killing and plundering the French, and calling the populations to revolt. He thus managed to form a band of more than 600 men, at the head of which he had the audacity to attack, with the support of the English fleet, the stronghold of Stralsund, defended by the brave General Gratian. They fought in the streets, and Major Schill was killed. The emperor had brought before the courts the young men of the best Prussian families taken fighting in Schill's following, and those unfortunates, condemned as thieves and assassins to hard labor for life, were sent to the Brest galleys. The Prussian nation was indignant at that treatment, but the government, understanding the true character of such acts of brigandage, did not dare to raise any protest, and confined itself to disavowing Schill and his band. It would have rewarded them if their enterprise had brought about the uprising of Germany. The Prince of Brunswick-Oles, whom the Treaty of Tilsit had dispossessed of his states, left England, where he had taken refuge, went to Lusatia, and raised a band of 2,000 men, with which he carried on partisan warfare against the French and the Saxons, their allies. In Westphalia, Colonel Dorneberg, one of the chiefs of King Jerome's guard, stirred up several districts and even marched on Kassel, intending to seize Jerome, whose favorite he had been only a few days before. Several Prussian officers, among others, Kat, also raised bands in various places, and it was later proved that they had received the tacit consent of the Prussian government. The junction of those different insurgent bodies, led by skillful and enterprising chiefs, might have had great and unfortunate results, and might have roused part of Germany against us. But, at the news of the Battle of Eckmühl and the capture of Vienna, all evaporated. The moment to unite all the forces of Germania against Napoleon had not yet come. The cooperation of Russia would have been necessary, then our ally, which was even supplying us a corps of 20,000 men. Those troops acted very feebly in Galicia, which did not prevent Russia from claiming, at the peace, its share of the Austrian spoils, which it never gave back. But let us return to the events that were taking place near Vienna. That concludes the 14th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.